Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Um, Welcome and thank you so much for joining our breakout session on inclusive interviewing and onboarding. I'm Jennifer Houston from Goodwill Industries of Southeastern Wisconsin and Metropolitan Chicago. Our panel today is made up of a variety of experts from Goodwill with over 90 years, you heard that, 90 years of combined experience in human resources and disability services. Our hope is that following this discussion, you'll leave with a better understanding of ways in which you can make your interviewing and onboarding process more inclusive and welcoming for all people, not just those with disabilities. Before we get started here, just a couple housekeeping items. Because we're meaning this to be an interactive discussion, you'll have the option to unmute your microphone and to ask some questions toward the end of the session. If you have questions while we're talking and you don't want to forget them, please feel free to write them in the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those at the end. We might answer it as we go along or again during the Q&A at the end. So right now, if you would, please take a moment, make sure your microphone is on mute, and if you could remain on mute again through the session until we get to that Q&A portion. As we're speaking during the session, if you'd like to see a large version of who's talking versus a gallery of the attendees, you can use the box in the right upper corner and select speaker view. That'll highlight whoever's speaking for you. The automatic captioning might also be showing up on your screen. If you prefer to turn that off, you can click the button on the bottom of your screen that says CC. I want to thank you for joining us again, and we'll get started here. So, Jake, if you could pop up the next slide. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Jennifer Houston. I'm the Mission Operations Manager at Goodwill. And prior to my current role, I've worked at Goodwill as a case manager, a supervisor, and a day services program manager, always with the goal of helping individuals with disabilities to live as independently as possible. We also have joining us today Keith Schrader. Keith is currently the supervisor of Goodwill's IPS and Community Employment Service. Born and raised in Milwaukee, Keith has a passion for helping others improve their lives through employment. Keith graduated from UW-Milwaukee with a bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology and completed his master's degree in educational psychology from UWM in 2006. After obtaining his master's degree, Keith began working with at-risk populations in the Milwaukee area. Keith's prior professional experience includes working at St. A's with young adults who've aged out of foster care. And there, Keith learned a lot about trauma-informed care, completed training in the neurosequential model of therapeutics. Keith went on to become a care manager and later worked at St. Charles Youth and Family Services, and finally joined Goodwill as an employment specialist in November of 2016. Thanks so much for joining us today, Keith. You're on mute.
Thank you for having me here.
Next up, we have Teresa Bruger. Teresa is the Manager of Community Employment and Connections with Goodwill Industries. Teresa's devoted her professional career to supporting individuals with disabilities to prepare and become employed in the community. She's responsible for overseeing Goodwill's pre-vocational community access program, supported employment, project search, and beyond work programs. After joining Goodwill in 2009, Teresa has served in a variety of mission services positions and has over 15 years experience in the field of disability services. Teresa holds a bachelor's degree in art therapy from Alverno College, and she's a contributing member to several local groups, including the Workforce Innovation Network, the Waukesha Transition Advisory Council, Milwaukee County Transition Advisory Board, and the Business Advisory Council. Thanks, Teresa, for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
And lastly, on our panel, we have Vernetter Montgomery. Vernetter is currently a human resources business partner here at Goodwill with 47 years of HR experience. Vernetter holds an associate's degree from MATC in business management and a Bachelor of Science degree in business management from the University of Phoenix. Vernetter's primary responsibilities here at Goodwill are partnering with our business units to drive performance through aligning the talent strategies and programs with business objectives. She conducts research, evaluates data, and reports on her findings. Vernetter serves as a consultant to our leadership on our talent management and on human resource related matters. Thank you for being here, Vernetter.
Thank you.
So at this point, Jake, if you could take down the slides and bring up our videos. Vernetter, I guess to start, how many people in the employment market have a disability?
Well, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 19.3% of persons with disabilities were employed in 2019. By contrast, the employment population ratio for people without a disability was 66.3%. So what this means is that individuals with disabilities are vastly underrepresented in the workforce, and that 1 in 4 adults in the United States has a disability. Of course, we don't know what's going on currently right now since the pandemic started, but I'm sure if we did, those numbers would probably be higher.
Mm-hmm. Keith, why do you think it is that individuals with disabilities are so much less likely to be employed, as Vernetter said?
Well, Jennifer, there is a number of reasons why individuals with a disability might not be employed or have some hesitancy towards applying to jobs. Some of it comes from the job seeker side, and some of it could come from impressions from employers. Some of the myths are that an individual with a mental illness might be considered a second-rate worker or quote-unquote damaged goods. Sometimes individuals with mental illness might think they cannot handle the stress on the job. Other times people have the misconception that people who might have a mental illness could somehow be unpredictable or dangerous in some way. And that is not true whatsoever. And I know one of the other myths is that some accommodations that an employee might need who has a mental illness or a disability can be expensive. However, we'll speak a little bit later at how that myth is quite a myth. Some of the other topics that come up when we're working with individuals is the feeling of being screened out during the interview process rather than being screened in. Applicants can be afraid of applying for a job. Sometimes the qualifications or the job description can be a little bit overwhelming for them, or they feel that if they don't match every single item on there, that they won't be qualified. And finally, for our in some of our individuals, we call it a benefits cliff. So because they might be receiving some type of Social Security support or just wanting to get back into the job market, they're typically wanting part-time work. And I know employers really want to get those full-time workers position filled first. But a lot of times looking for a part-time schedule to help maintain their benefits and just their work-life balance is important.
Thank you. Teresa, Keith talked about some of those preconceived notions that employers might have. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also he mentioned accommodations as a specific preconceived notion that an employer might have that might lead them to be hesitant to hire an individual with a disability. Can you expand on those kind of personal biases and accommodations?
Sure. So some of those could be that, the individual may not fit in with their coworkers or into their employment setting. Sometimes it could be that they won't be as productive as their other employees. Or it could just be, the fear of it's more difficult to manage someone with a disability, or just a fear of the unknown altogether. And some of that stems from, a lack of training for the supervisors or even the managers in working with individuals with disabilities, or even just the worries of the discrimination lawsuits that could come, or they might say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. But really, individuals fit in, to the culture. If anything, they help the culture of that employment site. And 9 out of 10, they're going to be more productive. They want to work. They're the ones that are going to be showing up every single day and enjoy working. Some of the accommodations Employers sometimes think that they're going to be too costly. And some fun facts for you is that 15% of accommodations cost nothing. That could easily be a job coach. That could be a picture task list, or even just a task list written and for them to check off. Sometimes 51% of accommodation costs is between $1 and $500. So really that's pretty inexpensive, 51% of that. So, and that could be an egg timer just to help the person stay on task, or have a time limit. Sometimes it could be a service dog, which is sometimes even free to the employer for that individual because they already have it. A raised desk for someone to be able to stand at work versus sitting consistently, a screen reader, or even a magnifier to help them do their job. And then the other piece of accommodations is that only 3% costs more than $5,000. Only 3%. So really when it comes to a cost of an accommodation, it's actually very minimal. And sometimes, again, some of those accommodations are nothing for the employer. So it really, for employers, some of those preconceived notions or myths are really that they are myths.
Thank you, Teresa. Vernetter, can you, I think that everyone is having trouble hiring right now. I think that's across the board for many, many jobs. Can you talk about the benefits of hiring an individual with a disability from that perspective, and how reevaluating, interviewing, and onboarding to be more inclusive helps add those people to the job market?
Well, I think, you touched on something that is definitely true, especially right now, that we are having a difficult hiring environment currently right now. But what it does is, one of the benefits of looking at people with disabilities is that it opens up a broader candidate pool. And so employers need to really take a look at, the interview and the onboarding, because not everyone is a good interviewer. Different disabilities sometimes will present, unique challenges for applicants to complete a traditional interview. So again, some of those individuals might enjoy tasks that others might not want to do based on their disabilities. And it does also contribute to having a more diverse workforce that benefits the broader community. So I think it really is important. There are definitely a lot of benefits, but understanding clearly that we're in a difficult hiring environment right now. But the fact that this opens up a whole nother candidate pool for employers. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Teresa, can you talk a little bit about neurodiverse candidates and how an individual, particularly someone who's maybe prone to be hyper-focused on a job, might be a good fit for a company?
Anyone that could be hyper focused on a task could be good for a company, because they're going to be ones that are going to be paying attention to detail, right?
Yes.
Sometimes they can be narrowed into a specific task. And it's an advantage to an employer, because it might be a task that another employee, isn't skilled at, or doesn't want to do, or don't have time to do. So there is always an advantage to that.
Thank you. Keith, we talked about the interview process, and I think Vernetter touched on the idea that not everyone's a good interviewer. Can you talk a little bit more about what we expect from individuals in an interview, and how personal bias comes into that versus what we're looking for in an interview related to the job?
Yes. So all of us, when we're interviewing a candidate, we all have our kind of preconceived ideas of what we're looking for and wanting to hear from, and even observing body language from our candidates coming forward to us. But not every candidate is going to be a good interviewer. They're going to be nervous. Everybody's a little bit nervous when interviewing for a job, but somebody who might have an underlying disability or mental illness might have a little more pressure to them, because not all disabilities can be seen. as my role as an employment specialist, we can always do our best for coaching and practice interviewing, remembering about handshakes and eye contact and smiling and even punctuality. But the truth of the matter is, people sometimes forget. Nervousness overrides the repetition and practice. And so kind of letting go of some of those small things, you know, is good because you want to be able to, see the forest through the trees. You want to see the good candidates in front of you. I had worked with somebody and she had really wanted a food service job and had multiple interviews but never got hired. And finally, I talked with her about joining her and cleared it with the hiring manager. This is for Buffalo Wild Wings. And it turned out she just tended to get a little bit off topic and wanting to really share who she was with her employer. So we had a very simple system. I sat next to her. I didn't say more than 2 sentences the whole half-hour interview, but the rest of the time I was gently tapping her on the foot to help remind her to keep her answers a little bit concise. So it's small things like that that individuals might not, understand. And the other thing too, actually, I'll just stop there. That's probably the best.
Thank you for that. I think it's so important to remember sometimes that, if a job isn't a sales job or a job where you're interacting with people, we're not interviewing someone for a handshake. It's not a handshake company. And maybe that skill isn't as important as the skills related directly to the job. Keith, you mentioned bringing a support person to the interview if desired, which I think is great. Teresa, in your work with individuals with developmental disabilities, can you talk a little bit more about bringing support people to a job interview, what that might look like for a company?
Yeah, so Keith talked about the interview process. So sometimes an employment specialist or developer may attend with the individual. Sometimes it could be that they might help reword a question that might have been asked so that they better understand it. But also to, a support person could be a job coach, right? So once they're hired on, they're able to support them in the job and help them pass that initial training by the employer. So they're a liaison in a way, right? But at the same time, they're not the employee. The job coach isn't an employee. They're there to support the person. We put the person first. So it is really just, focusing on your employee and what they can do, but it's using that coach as a helper to you as an employer. Because if you're giving instructions and the individual's not understanding, we're able to re-clarify that for them, or create those different tools that I talked about in regards to accommodations. A simple accommodation is allowing that employment specialist or that job developer to be in that interview with that person. And then also allowing that job coach and employment specialist is free to the employer, right? To be able to probe different ideas off of, or to say, hey, this isn't working. That support person is able to say, can we try this or implement something different? Or if someone's struggling, we're able to brainstorm with you and create those tools and offer those different accommodations so that the person can be successful in their job.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Vernetter, what are some of the other simple and easy things that we can change about the talent acquisition process and how we do interviews that'll better accommodate people?
Well, first of all, we have to allow individuals to bring a support person. We've talked about that. But we also have to allow them to have extra time to formulate an answer without judgment or offer, to rephrase a question. So, because sometimes people have to internalize what the question is. And the main thing is making sure that we're not screening out versus screening in the candidates, because there is a myth about that as well. Supplying questions in the interview format details in advance. So maybe sending some type of letter or something to the candidate that says, this is what's going to happen on this particular day, so be prepared. And so that helps them get into the mood of knowing that they're going to go through an interview. Consider how the necessary pre-assessments are to particular jobs. So sometimes looking at what their online skills are and doing those kind of assessments and things of that nature, or sometimes just doing something completely out of the box and having them do a tour and then do a Q&A while they're having that tour. So they'll get familiar with the surroundings of where they're going to be working at, exactly what they're going to be doing. So sometimes the interview can be just as simple as a walk around, see the work environment, and they can do their own assessment and determine if that's something that's going to work for them as well. So I think that kind of helps, because sight unseen sometimes just doesn't work for individuals. They really need to know what exactly it is that they're going to be doing and look at the environment to see if it fits for them. And sometimes, again, consider some of your questions and some of the questions in advance. Are you asking things like, what do you need? What do you see yourself in 5 years? Most of the time, people can't think that far in advance. Sometimes they can't even think what's going to happen the next day, let alone asking a question, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Too many things happen in that short period, in that long period of time. So we need to deal with the here and the now versus 5 years from now. So I think those are some of the things that we can do better and different to actually get the candidates more engaged and want to come and work for the organizations.
I think those are all really great points, and thinking about myself, even interviewing for jobs, making sure that I'm given those details. Where do I show up? What time do I show up? Do I check in with a receptionist? Who do I ask for? Everyone, as Keith said, has anxiety surrounding interviews, and all of the tips and tricks you mentioned, I think, help everyone through the interview situation, and not necessarily just individuals with a disability, which is great, especially
Absolutely.
in this hiring environment.
I've even known people that will find out exactly where the location is, and they might actually travel to it the day before, whatever else, just to get an idea of how long it's going to take them to get there on based on the traffic and not being late for the interview. Looking to see where the actual parking lot is if they drive or things of that nature. So all of those things, if you give them that advanced information, that really helps, move along the whole process.
Yeah, those are all great points. Thinking about, maybe we've screened in someone versus screening out, and we've gotten that person on the job. Bernardo, can you talk more about, as an HR person, the difference between simply orientating someone to the job and actually onboarding them? And what are some strategies to make that onboarding process more inclusive? Again, we're not just talking about strategies that are helpful for an individual with a disability, but really for every employee to make their experience more enjoyable.
Well, we have to have the mindset of knowing that getting people in the door just isn't enough. They may need some ongoing support. When I look at orientations right now, most people think that it's just getting them in there, filling out paperwork, the I-9, and going through policies and procedures, tax forms, and whatever else. But it's so much more than that, because we have to understand that new employee is coming into an organization or department that's already been established. There's already established relationships. So there's that stereotypical type of situations that actually happen. So it has to be a little bit more than that. In order for it to be successful, onboarding to me takes 3 to 6 months to get acclimated into a department or to an organization, because it's completely different from where they ever worked at before. In some cases, they've never worked at all. So now they're trying to establish themselves, trying to prove themselves that I was a worthy candidate to be hired. So they already know that they're being looked at. And in some cases, there might be an orientation period that they're not really, there's things that can happen to them in that period of time. So, consider asking those individuals, what is it that you need? Do you need accommodations? What are those accommodations that you need? And making sure that not only we're asking the question, but we're actually going to be sincere about what we're asking and what they actually need as well. So I think, we just need to learn best from doing those kind of things in advance, but also keeping in mind that they're coming into a new organization, relationships are already established, and just trying to get to learn the process, trying to establish relationships also with those individuals, and at the same time trying to show their worth as an employee of the organization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Teresa, as we're talking about what do people need, what are they good at, can you talk about the idea of job carving for an employee, especially in this job environment where everyone is looking for employees? you may have someone who doesn't fit all of your needs, but might suit most of your needs. So can you talk a little bit more about job carving?
Yeah, so job carving is simply enough. We actually do it quite often, more than employers think that they do. Because really job carving is taking the job description for an employee and realizing what do they not have time for, or what are they not skilled at, and pretty much removing some of those responsibilities from that employee and giving it to another employee. And within supported employment, we actually do that quite often because we want to match a job to an individual's skills and what are they good at. So an example could be at Walgreens. A lot of the individuals that we work with really don't have the money skills to run a cash register. So within Walgreens, we've worked with them to, really focus on the fact of you could have someone that is purely on cash register. Well, this individual can be stocking your shelves and helping customers find items so that your customer service is even better. So it's being able to carve out that cashiering responsibility for this individual to be employed. Another example is we actually had an individual who was great at making copies, faxing, and just being great with helping people. But the employer didn't have a job description that fit that. So they worked with their HR in order to create this position for this individual, so that he's helping the customers that come in to make copies, to print things, as well as helping them fax. Because realistically, how many people really know how to fax anymore? Right? You hit 9, you don't hit 9, you hit, so it's a lot of variables of depending on where you send it, but you have someone that can do it for you. Like, I need to fax this, here's the number. And that was his job. And it was to help keep things organized and clean and help push in chairs. And now he's actually increased his skills to help with resumes and even finding job leads. So they took, the small responsibility, he became proficient, and then they've added on responsibilities to him too, but they were willing to carve out a position specifically for him because they had a need. So very similar to that. I mean, like I said, employers do that often. It's additionally an accommodation for people too, because if they can't do something, why are you screening them out? Right, when they could be a valued employee who's going to come every day for you. So sometimes it is just taking a look at your job description and seeing, like, do they really need to lift 50 pounds in order to do this job? No. Because honestly, who can lift 50 pounds anymore? Right. So it is taking a look at that and just being okay to say this isn't a responsibility that they would have to do anymore. Because really it could offer an opportunity for someone to be successful long-term in your employment setting. And as they become proficient, you can add on more tasks to their day.
Thank you for that, Teresa. I do see some questions coming up in the chat, and one of them is, do you recommend job seekers disclose their disability? If so, how should they do it and when in the process? Vernetter, as an HR professional, are there legal considerations to asking individuals about disabilities in a job interview? And how best would an employer ask if accommodations are needed without, doing anything that's breaking the law?
Well, legally, you can't ask them directly if they have a disability. You can ask the question and show them the actual job description and ask them, can they perform the essential functions of the job with or without accommodations? And then that starts that conversation and engages them to say, yes, I can perform the essential function of the job. However, I have XYZ where I might need, a chair to sit down if it's a cashier job where they normally stand up, things of that nature. So you can ask it, but you can't ask it directly the way that some employers want to ask, because that does cause legal issues.
Once an individual is hired in an organization, can an organization ask them if they have a disability outright?
No, they cannot.
Okay. So I guess, Keith, my question to you is, how can an organization, Vernetter, I guess back to you, can an organization ask an employee to voluntarily disclose a disability?
Well, as part of the application process, There is a self-ID form that they can fill out. That does not go to management. It just goes strictly to HR and it stays in their file. But we can't, unfortunately, we cannot divulge that information to that hiring manager. So they'll disclose it, but it's all confidential. We cannot disclose that to the manager because again, we want to eliminate any hiring biases that those particular managers might have.
Mhm. So I guess it's really up to employers to kind of create an environment where people feel comfortable talking to their manager about what's going on in their life, whether that's family issues or health issues or things like that. Would you say that's true?
That is true. And sometimes when they do feel comfortable having those conversations with their manager, then of course, the manager will reach out to HR most of the time. And if it's something that is a disability that falls under the ADA, then we'll start that interactive conversation with them, provide them with paperwork that has to be completed, and gotten back to us. And then we'll determine based on the actual job, whether or not we can provide those accommodations. And going back to Teresa's point earlier about the cost that normally is required or whatever else, there really is not a whole lot of cost. If it's as simple as providing a chair or something like that, or a job coach or something like that, those kind of things do not cost a company a lot of money. And so, I mean, we look at it whether or not it poses undue hardship on an organization financially. Probably 90% of the time it does not.
Okay. Keith, going back to that idea of how can a company create a culture where an individual might feel comfortable disclosing their disability, whether that's on a voluntary form to HR or even to their supervisor so that they can get accommodations and have that conversation. What are some ways that a company can change their culture or things they can do to make people feel comfortable?
That's a good question, Jennifer. I think one of the first steps is a company just showing that they're an inclusive company and that they are understanding of all of their employees' needs. I believe there's a statistic of 1 in 5 individuals will, have a mental health concern or crisis at some point in their life, and that can come and go. Different mental illnesses. Some are persistent, and some are more manageable. Same with disabilities. Some disabilities are going to be persistent and throughout a person's life, but some might be rectified through accommodations and other surgeries. I think having an open door policy, having transparency, having like an employee support line for employees to reach out and contact their questions and concerns. Also, too, just by having that openness, and when an employee asks for a job coach to be able to come to the office or come to an interview, sometimes the initial reaction is, oh no, we don't want anyone outside coming in. But it's good to think and say, well, why not? Yes, why couldn't this person come in? And that opens the door to building that trust and rapport with that employee. And then I just see it as a positive perpetual motion machine. As one employee feels comfortable and has the support of the job, and that can build, other employees can see, wow, okay, Ted got some help when he was, struggling. Maybe I should go and approach my supervisor and talk with them a little bit. It really is just a positive motion that gets going within a company.
Thanks, Keith. I lost my connection. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Sorry about that. So Julie from Children's is asking, do we have a tip sheet to share with interviewers to remember when interviewing someone with a disability? I think so, Julie, what we'll do is put the slide back up with contact information for all of us. And I believe, let me see if I have the skills to copy and paste contact information into the chat as well. But what I would really recommend, if you're looking for some specific information, depending on what you're looking for. So for instance, Keith is very versed in working with individuals with mental health problems. And Teresa is very versed in working with individuals with developmental disabilities. So I would suggest, reaching out to any one of our folks here on their panel with all of this expertise.
I copied and pasted our Goodwill mental health toolkit into the chat. So that's another great resource. There's some online resources. There's some printable resources as well. And as Jennifer was alluding to, please reach out to any one of us. We are one of the Goodwill mantras is power of the whole. So if you reach out to Teresa, but the answer might be more in Vernetter's or my wheelhouse, she will be more than happy to loop us in to answer those questions. I was just looking, one I think best tips I can say, interviewing someone with a disability or someone who has a job coach or a job support person with them. You continue to address all questions to the candidate and the interviewee, and the support person will interject as needed. I would say introduce yourself to them and let them kind of and the candidate show what the role is going to be. As Teresa said, some people don't necessarily interview well, and so the job coach might do a lot of talking in the front end, but then once people settle down and they get used to the Q&A format, then that candidate can have a chance to kind of shine and talk some more.
Wonderful. Thanks, Keith. This is Carrie. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Carrie, yes.
Awesome. I can field some of the questions. Is there any experience dealing with ex-military with PTSD?
I can speak at least for some individuals in our IPS program who are ex-military, and other people who have PTSD diagnosis as well. We do a lot of conversations and talking with them about what type of triggers they might have, what type of environmental triggers, situational, to make sure that the environment is going to be healthy for them. This is where an employer willing to have a tour, just walking around, showing them an office setting, maybe even introducing somebody to a few coworkers if they're available. PTSD is, we're learning more and more about it, and it impacts every individual differently. So from our end, we have disclosure conversations with the individuals we work with about what they wish for us to share with employers and what not to. But ultimately, we do want to make sure that it's a good fit, not only for the employee, but for the employer as well.
And something else that could be recommended too is that it's a small accommodation, but for some individuals, it could be that they need a phone call with their support person behind the scenes. And a simple accommodation for individuals who may have PTSD too is that taking their 15-minute break and allowing them to break it into 3. So it allows them an opportunity to make a phone call to someone during that 15-minute break versus waiting until they're 45 minutes from now, right? It could be something as easy as that to allow them to make a phone call to that support person to get them through their day, get them through their shift, because they can talk to someone that might understand them and walk them through whatever is triggering them.
That's a great point, Teresa. Can you and Keith maybe talk a little bit more as well about how a company can adjust other policies to accommodate employees with mental illness? We have about 5 minutes left.
Sure, I can field a couple of the free ones, and that would be having flexibility with shifts, with hours of the week an employee might wish to work. also, like Teresa talked about, being willing to have alternative break schedules. Um, Sometimes a individual just needs that, I call it the 5-minute soda break, every hour to just go step away to be able to then go back and refocus on their job. So, so being open and flexible with time management is definitely one way an employer can accommodate.
Another one, I mean, I mentioned it earlier of, if that individual has a service dog, allowing them to have their service dog at work. Different settings may have different rules, but there's always a way. If you want to keep an employee that's very good and very skilled, and sometimes that service dog is an option as well. Sometimes it could be their transportation. So sometimes that individual can't drive themselves, so they're relying on a private transportation company to get them to work. They're not always reliable, unfortunately. So maybe being okay with adjusting their start time, or if they have potentially a bad morning, being okay with them calling you and say, hey, can I start an hour late? Just being flexible, like Keith said, I think is the best thing, and just being understanding, especially in that moment when things are happening, and just finding out how you can help them. And just asking, what do you need from me, can definitely be that one question that will help them open up.
Thank you. Finally, we have a question from Martha, and I guess Martha, I'd ask you to unmute. The question as written in the chat is, for client and customer facing roles, are there steps businesses take to create a successful interaction? Can you clarify what you mean by your question, Martha?
Yeah, I think it really comes from empathy and just transparency. If the role of the employee is interacting with customers who may or may not know or see what the disability is, and they come across or it presents itself during the interaction, is there a way to help both the customer and the employee have a successful interaction, that both customer and employee are not misunderstood in the course of doing business? For example, if the employee needs a little bit more time to process the transaction, or needs the client or customer to repeat the request, to make sure that frustration or misunderstanding doesn't prop up in those employee roles where you have customers and clients that may have short bursts of interactions, rather than colleagues and managers who have the time to better understand accommodations for success.
That's a great question. Does anyone want to field that? I think what I'm hearing you say, Martha, is how do we get the general public on board with not being frustrated, with not being judgmental? Would that be the case?
Yeah, I think the general public want to support, right? That there's no reason not to, but transactionally, when you go through your course of day and you're at, I was just thinking, a restaurant or some sort of transactional situation where you're interacting with an employee that may have a disability, it may or may not present itself during that transaction, a dinner, or purchasing movie tickets, or some sort of short burst of interaction. But if an event does present itself, if in transactional situations, perhaps a client or customer doesn't understand, they're confused, and so they respond to the situation rather than having more support. I don't know if I'm saying that clearly enough, but when you have short interactions and you don't really know the customer and you don't really know the employee, are there strategies that businesses can take to be more, to be transparent, or to set a more successful culture that we have the time to do for more long-term relationships that present itself in colleagues and manager, that's on a day-to-day basis, and longer term to develop that culture? This would be shorter term situations and transactional situations, knowing both employee and client and customer want to do the right thing. They just may not know how to react quickly enough.
Yeah, I can answer at least part of that, Martha. Some employees might wish to self-disclose, which they can always do, depending on the nature of their struggles. You know, there's organizations, there's different colored pins that people could wear that could sometimes be a symbol of what they have overcome to achieve that job. But on a more boots on the ground frame of mind, if this individual has a job coach or an employment support, and they've talked about the relationship with the employer, and I think it's all about developing strategies. We can't come up with a strategy for every scenario, but we can come up with a couple humdingers if we have to, of customer interaction, of communication skills, communication styles, you know, ways to work with an individual, and also to when is the appropriate time to ask for support from a coworker or a teammate. And another strategy we've had at other some of the stores I've placed my people is having that shift buddy. So when the situation might occur, if there's somebody who is usually stationed close by, that might be able to help out the individual. So those are just a couple of the answers I came up with off the.
Yeah, no, thank you. Those are great.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Martha. We are at the time for our session. So again, please, thank you for attending, and please feel free to look at the Goodwill website at some of these links. Again, they're in the chat and also on this slide here. And then everyone's email address is also in the chat and should be in the slides that will be shared later as well. So right now there's a break for lunch until noon. And I believe that Carrie put in the chat, yes, the Zoom link to use to get back into the session at noon. But again, I want to thank everyone for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.